If I asked you to make a little list of maybe the top 2 or 3 things that you least like thinking about or talking about, I wonder what would be on that list. At first, you might come up with some silly things like taxes or an overflowing email box or maybe a never-ending to-do list. But if I gave you maybe half a beat longer and nudged you to think a little more deeply, I wonder what you would say. My guess is that the things you would come up with would largely circle around the hardest things: tragedy, frailty, accidents that involve yourself or someone you love. And in the end, I bet all those things might ultimately circle around death and dying. Now, sometimes people say that clergy have only one sermon, that they preach 1,000 ways, and maybe that's true. In my very short little life as a preacher, I've talked a lot about death and dying. Daniel, our seminarian, reminded me of that this very morning. And it's what I'm about to do again. And so maybe this is the sermon I will have and will preach in 1,000 ways, and that'll be okay. Some of you will know, because some of you came, you'll know that we just hosted a 2-part series here at St. David's on the last things. These last things, of course, are death and dying and the necessary funeral planning that comes along with them. So we talked about really practical things like, I don't know, don't pick unsingable hymns, or don't pick dirges unless you really like dirges. Or maybe really think about, do you want that person to offer a eulogy? Can they be brief and not last for 45 minutes? Because no one actually wants to be here for 45 minutes. But we also talked about the harder things too. The grief, that which is past or present or yet to come, that accompanies death, and the fear that inevitably and rightly comes along with that. But we didn't end there, because we cannot. We also talked about hope. The hope we find in this faith, in our faith, and in the gospel that we seek to proclaim. We do ourselves a huge disservice, I think, if we don't ever talk openly with one another about this thing, which is the hardest thing. But we do ourselves a double disservice when we don't attach our thinking and talking about death and dying to the hope of the resurrection. Not because it makes us feel better or because it gives us a way out of a hard conversation we aren't all that keen to have, because it's true. That's why we do it. We do it because it's true, even when it doesn't really feel like it, or when I don't believe it, especially maybe on those days when I believe this is all just airy-fairy, light as a feather. In our reading for this evening, I chose Ezekiel, the Valley of the Dry Bones, one that's probably familiar to you. Ezekiel was one of the great Hebrew prophets and priests, and in this story, he finds himself quite literally face to face with death and destruction. What you may not know is that in the chapters that precede this one, Ezekiel watches as Babylon rips his homeland asunder. And then he and a host of God's people are marched off to exile. And there he will be dealt not one, but 2 nearly fatal blows. In one day, in the same day, Babylon destroys Jerusalem. And then Ezekiel's wife, the light of his eyes, the joy of his heart, dies suddenly, unexpectedly. And so despairing, Israel and God's people, they almost lose themselves. They almost forget who they are. They almost forget to whom they belong. God does not forget, but they do, just almost. It is in the midst of this that God gives Ezekiel a vision, and that's what you heard Maggie read. He sits the prophet down in the valley, full of dry, brittle, dusty bones, and then God strikes up a conversation. He invites Ezekiel to converse in his own vision. Can these bones live? God asks Ezekiel. Now Ezekiel, if he's anything like me, he must have been overwhelmed by the number and dryness and the vastness of them all around him. I wonder if he thought this was a trick question. Can these bones live? Surely he must have wanted to say, no, I don't think so. But he doesn't say that. Rather, he says, with maybe the very last measure of trust in him, God, only you know. And so God instructs Ezekiel to speak life to the bones, and he does. So they rattle and they shake and they take on human flesh and skin, but they lack the breath. So God speaks again, Ezekiel, call the breath, call the wind. And so a great wind is stirred up, and that wind brings God's own breath. And so the bones, with that breath, they live. So for the people for whom so much devastation had been wrought, they called upon the Lord as those who waited upon their hope. And this is still true today. In the too many war-torn and poverty-torn regions of the world, but also sometimes in our own ravaged souls too. Dry bones fill up graveyards all over the place, including sometimes in us. And so God, in God's mercy, strikes up a conversation. Yes, long ago with a weary Ezekiel, but also today with an anxious us. And in that conversation, God leads us to act in ways that awaken hope and bring life even when what we're looking at is a valley of dry bones. What we will learn later in the life and death of Jesus, as attested in the Gospels and in the tradition handed down to us from ages past, is our true belief that Christ died and was raised again. Death has been trampled down, death by death. It bears remembering these things, these most fundamental things. There will be a newness of life, a magnificent resurrection that swallows up death entirely. Death will not have the final word. Yes, it is some inhuman and hungering thing, something to be hated. It is an enemy, but it is an enemy whose end approaches and whose assault can inflict no final or permanent wound. We who are crucified with Christ, we who have died in the waters of baptism and have been raised to walk in newness of life, these things are trustworthy and true, and it does us good to remember them every now and then. And so, to God's question of Ezekiel, can these bones live? Yes, Lord, they can. This we do believe. Amen.